Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the final session in our spring series on the power of emotion. And we're so pleased that Dr. Sarah Wolf is teaching us today. As I mentioned last time she taught, it's really Dr. Wolf's current work on emotion in rabbinic texts that was a major inspiration for this series. Probably there aren't so many people joining us for the first time today, but if you are joining us for the first time, we welcome you. We also want, and I should say that that Professor Wolf is teaching us today on the Commandment of Joy. So we're happy also to end the series on a positive note. We've definitely gone into some heavy emotions over the course of the series, and I'm happy to sort of tie things together in a potentially more uplifting way. We are really excited to announce our next series, which is going to be kind of a shorter series between Pesach and Shavuot. As I mentioned last time, it's called Relating to God. And it's going to run from April 25th to May 23rd. I think we're about to put information into the chat on that. So we have 5 different scholars who are going to be leading us through exploration of different ideas from Jewish texts and thought about how we understand God, experience God, exist in relationship with God or not, depending on the person and the situation. So that's our spring mini series. Obviously that's a topic we could do for much more than 5 weeks, but there you go. I want to also thank so much the sponsors for today's session. Lois Goldrich, thank you, and hello, Lois, for sponsoring today in memory of Kenneth Goldrich, a very funny man and author of the conservative movement, Luach. So it's from you, his loving wife, and his children and grandchildren. We're honored to be having this teaching today in his memory. So thank you for sponsoring at the Chacham level, Lois and family. And also at the Chacham level, thank you so much to Sarah B. Askin, who is sponsoring in honor of the staff who plan these programs, the scholars who share their expertise, and the tech staff who keep us connected. Sarah, we appreciate that so much. It's our pleasure to put together this programming for all of you. But thank you so much for that gratitude and recognition. And on that note, I actually do want to, since it's our last session of the series, I do want to call out a couple of specific people who, in addition to our faculty who usually get the glory, and I get the glory too, but I really want to lift up 3 people who work very hard on the series. Tani Schwartzerman, you see every week, but she is the key person putting it all together, all the back and forth with the faculty, inviting them, working out their topics, working on selecting the topic for the series, all of that. So Tani, thank you so much for your really hard work on the series. Lynn Feynman, you also are frequently in touch with Lynn, who does just so much administrative support for this series. We could not do it without her. Thank you, Lynn. And Ellie Gettinger, who you met a couple of weeks ago when she facilitated one of the sessions. She gets the sessions online. I know a lot of you do view them online, and many other people on the JTS team as well, and communications and other folks in our community learning team. So thank you to everyone. And on that long note, Tani, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman, and thank you to all of you who join us each week. Such a pleasure to be able to coordinate the series and to come in person. I mean, to come to be on the Zoom for the sessions. So hopefully most of you are familiar by now with kind of the logistics of our sessions, but I'll review Dr. Wolf will pause periodically for questions throughout our session and leave time again at the end of the session for Q&A. You can chat your questions to Rabbi Andelman. She'll select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Wolf. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with myself or Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session this morning. We'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Wolf, Assistant Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS. Her current book project examines the construction of emotions as legal categories in rabbinic literature. And as Rabbi Andelman mentioned, is really the inspiration for this series. Dr. Wolf is also a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And we're so pleased to have her back again teaching us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Wolf in just a minute.
Thanks so much, Tani and Rabbi Andelman, and thanks to all of you for joining for this last session. So, as has been mentioned a few times, the theme of this semester's learning is really closely connected with my current research project, which, as Tani described, looks at the construction of emotions in rabbinic literature as legal categories. And if you think about just sort of in general, not necessarily in terms of rabbinic literature in particular, but in general, what does it mean to think about emotions in a legal context, right? We might think about the question of what kinds of emotions do we want to protect people from, right? I think that's a sort of legal move that might be familiar to some of us. For example, in contemporary law, right, you can sue not just for physical damages, but for emotional damages, right? Emotional distress. That's something that the legal system wants to, if not protect you from, right? Can't necessarily prevent you from feeling emotional distress, but at least compensate you for. Or if we think about maybe laws that are designed to prevent people from feeling humiliated by being stigmatized or discriminated against, right? There are ways in which, right, the law is dealing with emotions that, right, are more negative in certain respects, and that the law wants to address as things that are problems or, you know, mitigating factors. Let's say, you know, somebody commits a murder in the heat of passion. And so the law is going to say, aha, that's a different kind of crime than somebody who kills in cold blood. And the emotion that we're going to talk about today, as Rabbi Andelman said, ending on more of a positive note, is the emotion of joy. And I think it's a little bit trickier just on an intuitive level, before we're seeing any of the sources, right? To imagine, what does it mean to think about laws about joy, right? If you've never seen any sort of Jewish text about this before, right? If you have, you can pretend you haven't. If you haven't, great, right? What does it mean to have joy as part of the law? And so what we're going to look at today is sources from our tradition that actually talk about a commandment to feel a certain way. And this is something that I think for modern readers can actually be quite challenging. So even though we're sort of ending on a positive note, we are going to sort of deal with what is actually maybe a little bit difficult about a commandment to feel joy. And I'll just sort of give a few sort of scenarios from Jewish context and also non-Jewish context when you yourself might have kind of come up against this kind of difficulty. So in a Jewish context, for example, let's say, this isn't joy specific, but right, let's say you're attending services for Yom Kippur or Tisha B'Av, and you feel like, I'm expected to show up here and be in a particular mood. I'm expected to be solemn. I'm expected to be sad. And, I'm really not feeling it today. And I feel this kind of pressure that my emotions aren't lining up with what I'm told that I'm supposed to feel, right? Or, right, I'm sure even in non-Jewish context, right, you've been in a situation where you're at a wedding, but you're in a horrible mood, right? Or, you're about to go out on some kind of adventure and somebody says to you, have fun. And you're thinking, I have a cold. I haven't done my taxes yet. I just got a bad phone call from my sister. Like, I'm not going to have fun. Why are you telling me to have fun? So these are some of the questions, right, that we're going to be looking at in the context of commandments from the Torah to feel a particular way, which is, what does it actually mean to command somebody to have a feeling? What is going on when the Torah commands us to have a feeling? Do classical Jewish texts leave room for people to have mixed feelings, right? Or for people to have a particular kind of emotional state that doesn't seem to fit with what they are, quote unquote, supposed to be feeling in that moment. And related to that, we're going to be thinking about, in this context, what's the connection between your internal self, right? What you're feeling inside, and your external self, how you're behaving, how you appear to others. So in classical Jewish texts, is it okay to be doing something, right? Acting a certain way, even if your heart isn't totally about play out in these sources that talk about commanding particular emotions. And I hope that at the end of the class, we'll have a little more of a sense both of what these Jewish sources are asking of us when they command these particular things, but also how we think about emotions in our own lives, how we think about these moments when maybe we want to be feeling a certain way, but we're not, or we feel that we're expected to be feeling a certain way, but we're not, right? How do we kind of navigate that tension? And what are maybe some strategies that Jewish sources can help us with in terms of navigating those moments? So we're going to start off looking at some texts from the Torah that contain these emotional commandments. We're going to look at those texts. I'm going to pause after we do that, I think, for a first round of questions. And then we're going to turn to some sources from Bible scholarship, from moral philosophy, and then to the rabbis to see what they have to say about some of these questions. And we're going to talk not just about joy, just for a heads up, but we're actually going to be talking very shortly about love as well, which I know that for those of you who have been around for the series, you've explored in other contexts. But it's important for us, for our particular conversation today, because these are basically the two main emotions, certainly the main positive emotions that appear as commandments in the Torah, right? So when both contemporary scholars and ancient rabbis are trying to think about this question of what it means to be commanded to feel a certain way, right? Those are kind of the big two to look at, right? This commandment to feel joy and the commandment to love. So let's, Tani, if you could share the sources, that would be great. So we're just going to start by taking a look at those sources just to have a sense of what is going on there. Okay, so source number one, the particular source that I brought here for us to look at together happens to be from the book of Devarim, but this particular commandment actually appears a number of times in the Torah, and it is a commandment to have joy. Okay, this is the main locus for the commandment for joy. And the Torah commands us to be joyful at a particular time. V'samachta b'chagecha, you shall rejoice in your festival, okay? And in fact, not just you, but interestingly, the Torah commands this feeling for everybody who is around, more or less, okay? And the verse here lists a whole bunch of people, both people who are going to be members of one's household, right? One's children, in biblical times, one's male and female slave, okay? So sort of household servants who are around, and then kind of other people who are just in the community, the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your communities, right? Maybe people who ordinarily in their lives are not experiencing quite so much joy. All of these people have to have joy in the festival. And just to sort of bracket all of these different types of people, some of whom may actually not be experiencing a ton of joy, because we're actually going to come back in several sources to sort of how interesting it is that the Torah commands joy not just of you, but of all these other people. But okay, we'll bracket that for now. The text here continues in the next verse to explain that, right, people should be having their festivals, meaning having a chag, talking here about the holiday of Sukkot, but in general, this becomes sort of expanded to thinking about joy on all the sort of major pilgrimage festivals. So this is Passover, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. There's going to be joy during all of these holiday times. There's a sort of closing idea that, right, God is going to bless all your crops and all your undertakings, and you will have nothing but joy. Okay, so already I think we can ask a few questions based on what this verse doesn't tell us. Okay, it tells us that we're supposed to feel joy. It tells us when, during the holiday, that's helpful. It tells us who, basically everybody, that's helpful. But it doesn't really say why or how. Maybe we could argue that the second verse, verse 15, which says you should hold a festival for God in the place that God chooses, is kind of telling you how by celebrating the holiday. Still not totally clear, right? Is that really going to get everybody to this state of joy? If it just wanted you to celebrate the holiday, it could have just said celebrate the holiday. So, right, how are we supposed to then get to this state of joy? Not totally clear, right? What's supposed to be the impetus, right? Maybe we're supposed to feel joy because God is blessing crops and all of our undertakings, but maybe that's the reward, right? That's supposed to happen, right, upon proper feelings of joy and observance of the holiday. And also, right, we have a big question here. What happens if it's a bad harvest year? And in fact, you're feeling terrible about your crops, right? Or, of course, extrapolate that to, modern economic circumstances or, whatever modern source of stress, displeasure, right, is going on for you around the holidays. People in your family are being difficult or have COVID, and like Passover is not feeling joyous at all, because of whatever else is going on, right? What are people supposed to do? Okay, so we're gonna come back to some of those questions. So sort of hold them in your head for now. But first, we're gonna turn to the other example that I mentioned that we're going to be talking about, which is the commandment to feel love, and see if that helps us at least frame the question a little more clearly. Okay, so the commandment to love appears also in the book of Devarim, in Deuteronomy, and it's not attached to a particular time, like the commandment to rejoice during a festival, but rather it is a commandment to love God. Okay, and for those of you who have spent time in Jewish prayer services, you may find this verse familiar because it is the first line of the Shema Prayer, which is actually a selection of biblical text. Okay, and it tells you that you should love God, v'ahavta es Adonai Elohecha, b'chol levavcha, with all your heart, b'chol nafshecha, with all your soul, uv'chol me'odecha, and with all your might. Okay, so again, just taking this verse in and of itself, lots of questions here. How are you supposed to do that? Why are you supposed to do that? And what happens if you're not feeling it, right? What happens on a day that you're feeling distracted or actually really angry at God because something terrible has happened in the world or in your life, okay? So in the case of love, this commandment to love, we have maybe some helpful information in the verses that follow this one. Okay, so I've left them as a separate source here on the sheet, even though source that's numbered here on the sheet, source 3, actually immediately follows from source 2 in the Torah, because I want us to think about, we're going to think about what is the relationship exactly between source 3 and source 2. But so let's look at now the verses that follow on this commandment to love God. Okay. And again, this may be familiar to you from the Shema, but right, let's try to think about it, not in that prayer context, but just in the context of, okay, what is the Torah actually asking for here? So the Torah says, take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day, impress them upon your children, recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and of your gates. Okay, so what does this have to do with loving God? So I want to propose two possible ways of reading the connection between the commandment to love and these various instructions to basically be talking about these instructions, which seems to be a reference to, right, the laws that are being given over in the Torah, maybe these particular ones, or maybe sort of the larger set of laws in the Torah at large. So two possible ways to read the connection between these pieces, I think. So one is as follows. Step 1, love God. Okay, and then having done that, figure out how to do that. I don't know, up to you, right? Figure out how to love God. Step 2 is, now that you have this love, you should manifest it basically by going around thinking about, reciting, teaching all of the things that God has told you about and commanded you all the time, right? So first, you have to figure out what it means for you to love God. This is going to be some kind of presumably, psychological process that you have to go through as an individual, okay? And then once you have figured out how to do that, you are then going to sort of go around all the time, immersed in God's commandments and in God's Torah, here's a second option for how to read the connection between these verses. Okay. Love God. How do you do that? As follows. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Teach them to your children. Recite them when you're home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Put them on your hand. Put them, in your tefillin, right? As these verses get interpreted, put them on your mezuzahs. Make sure that they're everywhere around you. And, right, that's basically what the Torah is telling you, not separately, but as kind of the rest of the thought of the commandment to love God. It's then giving you specific instructions for how to fulfill that commandment. And I'm highlighting that these are two different ways to read this relationship between Devarim chapter 6, verse 5 and Devarim chapter 6, verses 6 through 9, because I think that they illustrate two different paradigms for how we can think about the commandment to have a feeling that we're going to explore further in the rest of the sources, right? One of them is, if you're telling somebody to have a feeling, right? Feelings are internal, they're personal, they're private, they're separate from external behavior, or they have to come first. And external behavior then can follow from them, right? But feelings have to arise naturally, spontaneously, they have to be genuine, right? And then you can talk about action. Paradigm number 2 is that actually feelings are potentially a result of your actions, or feelings aren't necessarily separable from what you do. It's not necessarily so easy to just kind of cultivate them or wait for them to arise spontaneously, right? And actually, at least for the Torah or for classical Jewish sources, right, what we can ask people to do is a set of behaviors that are going to help them maybe cultivate a particular feeling or express a particular feeling, right? And that's kind of what we can ask from people, right? That we're not asking people to spontaneously generate an emotion, right? But to be performing a particular set of behaviors. And either that's kind of the extent of what that emotional commandment is, right? Or that is going to be kind of the impetus to help people get to that emotion. Okay. So I hope those two paradigms are clear. If they're not, I'm going to pause now for questions and comments. So happy to hear questions either about those different options for reading this text, about the framing, about these verses, and then we're going to turn to some biblical scholarship.
I think the paradigms were clear. Most of the, we might get some more now. Most of the questions and comments that I have now are things that I think you're going to address later. I'll just say that the way you were just laying out those paradigms, it really reminded me of what I'm interested to know if you think it's a parallel paradigm, which is part of how we think about prayer. With these two concepts of keva and kavana, that you do prayer in a fixed way at fixed times, and there's sort of a rote and commanded aspect to it, and we're commanded to do it whether or not we feel it in the moment, and then also the aspiration to really be meaning the words and have real intention when we do it, which is kavana, and the idea that the keva can enhance the kavana, and but I think a lot of people sort of struggle with that with that tension. Can I do the keva without the kavana? And I think it seems parallel to me to what you're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I have potentially a lot more to say about that parallel. But I'll just say, so I'm actually, I have a friend and a colleague who's writing his PhD at Columbia, actually also focusing on joy in rabbinic sources, and has been working on prayer for a forthcoming article. His name is Erez de Golan, so you can keep an eye out. We're actually, we're both of us are contributing articles to, hopefully will be published in the fall, a special issue on emotions in Halacha in the Journal of Textual Reasoning. So I don't know, keep an eye out for that. But anyway, he is working on this question of sort of the proper affect for prayer and rabbinic sources that deal with this issue. And there's a rabbinic text from the Mishnah that talks about ein omdim lehitpalel ela mitoch koved rosh, that we don't get up to pray except from a place of, and literally it's heavy-headedness. And he's trying to figure out, right, what do the rabbis mean by that exactly? And one of the things that he is finding is that a large piece of this has to do with behavior and even with sort of attention to the physical body. So the examples that the rabbis give in the Mishnah of what koved rosh mean have to do with focus in the sense of not responding to physical distractions, right? So even if the king is saying hi to you, you don't say hi back. Even if a snake is wrapped around your ankle, you ignore it because you're so focused on your prayer, right? But these are all things that have to do with you're hearing things, you're feeling things, you have particular bodily sensations, right? Those certainly happen. But you have a physical posture, right? And it may even be that koved rosh has to do with, like, you're actually imagining that your head is down, your eyes are down, you're not looking around, right? Because you have this focus, but also because that's the way to get to this focus. And I think that, right, when we talk about this tension potentially between, kava, the fixed prayers, and kavanah, the emotion that we're supposed to be feeling, right, or the sort of maybe, attention that we're supposed to be bringing to the prayers, right? We're kind of looking at them through a contemporary psychological paradigm in which, right, there is this kind of sharp distinction between the commanded ritual and then what's kind of genuine, internal, spontaneous feeling, right? And I think that maybe for the rabbis, that kavanah, that focus or the emotional attention that's supposed to be brought to prayers is actually very much an embodied practice as well. It's something that, right, is also a set of behaviors in a way, or a particular physical posture. And I think there's something potentially helpful about thinking of it that way, because, right, it reduces the pressure a little bit, right? It's not actually about, I have to show up and mean it every time, right? And if I don't, I'm having a problem. But that actually what the rabbis are asking is, okay, within this, requirement to have fixed prayers 3 times a day, what are then the actions that you're going to cultivate within that ritual framework to ensure that you're really paying attention, right? Or to encourage you to be really paying attention, right? As much as you possibly can.
A couple of people have commented about, in the same vein, about love and how one of the primary ways that we express love is through, is through acts of love, right? Like, not just saying I love you, but doing things to make that tangible, and how, you could argue that the object of your love can't really necessarily feel your love if it's not made tangible in some way. It doesn't need to be a thing, but right, enacted in some way. And then someone also raised, I think that this came up in the session that we had with Rabbi Michal Springer a few weeks ago on loneliness, but psychological studies that show that that smiling can make us happier, right? That which I think is very connected to what you're saying. That what you're talking about, cultivating emotion through action. So it seems that that's borne out in the psychological literature.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and I'm going to come back to that idea for sure of that there are particular, again, physical things that you can do in order to cultivate emotions. Yes, absolutely. Great. Okay, let's go back to the source sheet, and we're going to turn now to source number 4, which is the first piece of a debate, and I say debate even though the sources that we're going to look at are written 40 years apart, but that's how academia works, a debate between 2 biblical scholars about what exactly it means in Dvarim to be commanded to love God. Interestingly, both of these sources are actually from non-Jewish biblical scholars. They're both writing for this journal, the Catholic Bible Quarterly, but they are both religious thinkers, and they're both really concerned actually with what are, especially the second scholar who we'll see in a few minutes, what are the theological implications of how we are defining this commandment to love. Okay, so our first source is this scholar, Bill Moran, and Bill Moran points out, love in Deuteronomy, and he's not just talking about in our verse, he's talking about in the whole book of Deuteronomy, is in general a love that can be commanded. And he says it's also a love intimately related to fear and reverence. Above all, it is a love which must be expressed in loyalty, in service, and in unqualified obedience to the demands of the law. For to love God is, and then he's going to now be citing specific examples of verses in Deuteronomy in which love appears, in answer to a unique claim to be loyal to God. This is not my gendered God language, it's Moran, so I'm going to take a little liberty here, to walk in God's ways, to keep God's commandments, to do them, to heed God or God's voice, to serve God. It is, in brief, a love defined by and pledged in the covenant, a covenantal love. So what Moran is calling our attention to is ways in which love in Devarim is different, than the way you and I sort of talk about love most of the time, right? We think about love, even if, as, Julia brought out, folks were saying that, lots of the love that we feel towards people in our lives is expressed in actions. And I think that's 100% right. Moran is pointing out that love in Deuteronomy for God is expressed not just in terms of actions, but in terms of what it means for the covenant between God and the Jewish people. And that love in Deuteronomy actually really means something more like obedience or fealty. And there's been arguments made that are even a little stronger than kind of the way it's framed in this paragraph, that modern readers see the biblical Hebrew word ahava, which is the same as the modern Hebrew word for love, which you would use to describe the love between parents and children, or lovers, or, family members, and they assume that this word ahava in the Bible means essentially what it means today. And Moran and some people who have sort of followed his scholarship would argue, actually, it really doesn't. This is an anachronistic definition of ahava, or love, in the Bible. And because love, right, love, in quotes, I'm making little air quotes, in the Bible can be commanded, it's actually talking about something very different, right? And it's actually talking about, right, some kind of obedience to the covenant, right? So this would be a read that says, essentially, when Dvarim tells you to love God, what it's really telling you to do is a specific set of actions. And, right, potentially, the Torah doesn't care that much, or even understand really a sense of there being some kind of emotion that is separate from that. Like, that's it. That's what ahava means for the Torah, according to Moran, is to do this specific set of actions. And that's really kind of the be all and end all. Okay, so that is one possible position, and it's kind of an extreme position, right? Because it doesn't really allow for a ton of continuity in terms of how we think about love necessarily, and the kind of love that's being discussed in Dvarim, right? But it also, right, is potentially useful in terms of answering our question, our challenge of how can the Torah command us to feel a particular way, by saying, like, well, it doesn't, right? It's really just commanding us to do particular things, and that's really what it means by love. So we're going to see in a couple of minutes a response written 40 years later by another biblical scholar writing in the same journal. Her name is Jackie Lapsley, and she is going to take a bit of a different take in terms of this question of what love in Deuteronomy means. And her position is going to draw from the views of a moral philosopher named Martha Nussbaum, who has written a lot about emotions, to some extent in law, actually, but primarily in moral thought. And I've included an excerpt here from one of her books about emotions and ethics, called Upheavals of Thought, The Intelligence of Emotions. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's quite long, but I'm just going to sort of summarize for you her view, which is that emotions themselves today are not just kind of irrational or contentless sensations, but they actually involve a cognitive piece. And by cognitive, she explains, she just means receiving and processing information. So even if that's not something that people are aware that they're doing when they're having an emotion, or something that they're doing on purpose, right? Emotions at some level involve some kind of judgment. And she says, actually, in moral thought, it's really important to think about emotions in this way. She says, because if we see emotions just kind of as impulses, as she puts it, right, as just sort of these irrational, spontaneous things that you can't really control, right, then kind of the only way we can respond to them is by suppressing them, right? Because there's sort of no way to control what they are or how they arise, right? And she sees this really as a problem. And she says that the advantage of what she calls the cognitive evaluative view of emotion is that it actually shows us where societies and individuals have the freedom to make improvements, right? We can actually think about, if we take Deuteronomy's language of teaching things to our children, right? When we are involved in education, right? What are we teaching children? She asks, about what and whom to fear, what occasions for anger are reasonable, what behavior is shameful, right? She says, emotions are actually, constructed in some ways by what we teach people is appropriate in terms of their emotional responses, right? And so she gives an example, right? If we teach people that people with different skin color are threatening or dangerous or evil, right, that is going to shape the way people in our society are going to have emotional responses, right, to, let's say, encountering somebody with a different skin color on the street or in a store, right, as opposed to thinking about, well, actually, we can teach people from an early age, that people who are different, actually should not occasion us to be scared or to be protective, and that might actually have a real impact in terms of how specific relationships play out and how society plays out. Okay, so this idea that emotions actually can be cultivated through education, and that this cultivation of emotions is really important in terms of making moral judgments, is going to be a really important piece of our next source, going back to our debate between biblical scholars, turning to source number 6 from Jackie Lapsley, responding to Moran, thinking about what it means to love in Deuteronomy. So Lapsley is taking Moran's argument, and says, okay, so one reason that is urged for understanding Israel's love for God is obedience, this is Moran's thing, is that this love is a love that can be commanded. And she says, this is a problem because this argument falls into the trap of driving a wedge, and she says a typically modern wedge, between emotion and action. She says, actually, no, this is the view that's anachronistic. Moran is assuming that, because ahava, love in Deuteronomy, is manifested through a set of commands, therefore it's just about those commands, and it's not about anything that resembles the way we think about love now. And she says, no, this doesn't make any sense, She says, some scholars have noted that this argument does not hold up under scrutiny. As Jeffrey Tigay observes, the idea of commanding a feeling is not foreign to the Torah, which assumes that people can cultivate proper attitudes. Okay, the objection that feelings cannot be commanded relies on the modern notions, not only that feelings exist within the private world of the individual, but also that they are uncontrollable. And she says, in fact, we don't have to think about love this way. She says, what we need is a totally different explanation. And if we can hear the Deuteronomic view of love correctly, it will likely offer a trenchant critique of our modern construction of love with its uncontrollable romantic feelings and actions. And in the rest of her article, she basically says that what we need to do is to think about the love commanded in Deuteronomy in the way that Martha Nussbaum is encouraging us to think about emotions as ethical tools. That love in Deuteronomy can and should be commanded and cultivated as an emotional response that also has some degree of a cognitive element, right? Hence the way in which it can be cultivated, right? Because there are these things that actually we're supposed to be teaching people about, right? What Israel's relationship with God is, right? What it means to be in a covenant that is supposed to help people actually cultivate that love, right? And potentially, right, the actions that are listed in Deuteronomy are connected to that too. But they're not, for Lapsley, they're not the be all and end all. They're not where the story ends, right? That what's being commanded for her in Devarim is not just, right, reciting Torah when you get up and when you lie down, but actually the love itself. And that if we reject that as not possible, right, as something that doesn't make sense, that we're actually rejecting a potentially important way to develop, as she thinks the Torah is asking us to do, as moral subjects. Okay, so that's a lot of somewhat dense stuff. So I'm gonna take this opportunity to pause again and see if there are questions and comments. And then we're going to turn back to some classical Jewish sources, and we're also going to turn back to the Commandment of Joy after this.
There was just a nice comment about Fiddler on the Roof and, you know, the "Do You Love Me" song and interchange between Tevye and Golda, where I'm just going to read the way the person wrote it. That it's about actions expressed due to their covenant, what a marriage is in a community. Obedience and fealty were great parts of love and marriage for all the generations until, quote, modern love. I've been thinking about this also. I don't know if you or anyone else has been watching Bridgerton, the new season of Bridgerton, but it's in the 1800s in England and all about sort of high society and how matches are made, which is very quickly, right? And their right, love is a great bonus when it happens, but they're looking much more at other things that make someone a suitable partner, right, which is also, even if you think about traditional Jewish marriage, right, we don't, in a wedding ceremony, we don't we don't talk about love, honor, and obey. It's like the core of a Jewish wedding ceremony is about a commitment to a monogamous commitment. So I guess the argument here is I guess more like Moran, is that the first position? That maybe it really is sort of a modern concept to extract love from these kinds of more tangible commitments. But I liked that. I liked that example from Fiddler. And right, someone's noting kind of the political and economic aspects of those kinds of matches, which is different from love with the divine, but it's still about, right, arrangements that work for both parties.
Yeah, 100%. And there's actually, this is not my area, but there's biblical scholarship that I think is quite well accepted at this point, showing that there are elements of the book of Devarim that actually resemble treaties in which, like treaties from the 7th century BC of people pledging loyalty to a king, basically, and that Devarim shares similar language with some of those treaties, right? So even though, of course, it is different, right, clearly there is this sense that, what's going on is in some way transactional, right? That, right, or our source about joy, right? And that the sort of payoff is going to be like God is going to bless you and you're going to have good crops, right? There's a transactional piece of covenantal Judaism in general. And I think it is really important to keep in mind when this is certainly something that is a big question for my research, you know, the ways in which our ideas about emotions like love have changed over time. So yeah, I definitely appreciate the reminder that, right, even our ideas about marriage, right, or about falling in love with somebody are definitely quite modern in certain ways, and maybe are not shared, right, with you know, the rabbis or, you know, biblical sources. And I think at the same time, there's a question of, do we say there's a total disconnect there, right? And in fact, all the Torah is concerned about is basically like, are you living up to your covenantal duties? And they're kind of calling that love, right? Or is it something more like, right, like the song from Fiddler, I think is a good example, because I don't have it in front of me, but I think that, right, the sort of funny tension in that song is, right, Tevye's asking Golda, do you love me? And she's like, how could you even ask me that? I did this, I did that. I, you know, helped you, you know, gave birth to all your kids. And like, what do you mean? And then at the end, she says, well, I guess I do, right? Which I think implies that she's thinking about her love for Tevye as something that is connected to having been married to him for 25 years, maybe has developed out of all of these things that she's done for him for 25 years, but that actually just those actions, they themselves aren't the entirety of what it means for her to love him. Right? At first she thinks they are, and then she says, oh, actually, right, there's also this feeling that is connected to those actions I've expressed through those actions. Maybe that those actions have sort of helped me, right, to cultivate, right, but it maybe, right, it's actually a separate piece. So it's an interesting case study.
Yeah, we could spend the rest of the time on that song, but let's not. So, all right, so I don't know if you want to go in this direction or not, but someone brought up, you know, I think a very interesting, I was bringing up keva and kavanah. Someone's brought up another tension that potentially applies, which is about doing mitzvot because, you know, fulfilling a certain commandment because you're obligated to versus because you want to. And, you know, there too, we have things that can be linked or not linked, depending on the occasion and the person. And, you know, as you know, there's an idea in halakha, in Jewish law, that doing something out of obligation is actually a higher level of doing the mitzvah, which I think sometimes we bristle at a little bit. So I don't know if you want to go into that framework and how it relates to what you're talking about or not.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that sort of that framework in halakha is interesting. That, right, and it's whatever the context in which it comes up is actually very interesting, because it's a rabbi, Rabbi Yosef, who is blind, who is not sure if he, as a blind person, is obligated in all the mitzvot. And he's been doing them anyway. He's just been doing them. And at first he's like, oh, I hope that I'm not actually obligated, because then I've just been doing these things, you know, optionally, and maybe that's better. But then he finds out, actually, no, it's better to do things that you're commanded to do. And he says, ooh, like, actually, I hope it turns out that I really am commanded to do them. And, you know, he is, as it turns out, and he's, you know, he's very happy about that. You know, yeah, I think it definitely gets at this tension, right? Because you can think about, right, what what does it facilitate kind of in either paradigm, right? You're right, I think, Rabbi Anselman, that people do bristle at the idea that you should do things because you're commanded as opposed to because you want to do them. And at the same time, right, it does kind of, again, let people off the hook for doing things which they can control, even if they don't feel like it, which can be cultivated, but is a little less easy to control, right? So to know that you're kind of still going to get the points, let's say for, I don't know, performing the mitzvah of visiting the sick, even if, you find that particular sick person kind of annoying and you didn't really want to go and bring them, a meal today, but it's the right thing to do. And so you do it, and right, you can actually get the credit, right, under that kind of framing, right? As opposed to a world in which we're kind of expected to, have a particular set of affects from the get-go, right? And I think the rabbis know that is a really hard ask. It's interesting, right? I think a lot of us may think of this also as kind of something that is quintessentially Jewish, right? As opposed, right, that this is a little bit of a cliche, that Judaism is a religion of action, right? Whereas, Christianity, or at least Protestant Christianity, has much more to do with kind of, what is in your heart and sort of the purity of your thoughts or your feelings. And it's just, I'm kind of having this moment of being amused by, right, early Christian kind of critiques of Judaism were, the law is impossible. It's impossible to fulfill the law. How could you really do all of these things? There's no way that, this really is binding, because it's just out of people's reach to do all of this. And so the law in Christianity is abrogated, right? Actually, the mitzvot are not binding. And I think you can kind of say that there's maybe implicitly the opposite critique, right, coming from Judaism, which is, no, the thing that's impossible is having a pure heart. Who can do that, right? How can you ask people to do that? The only thing we can really ask of people, right, is actually to do their best to fulfill the commandments, right, whether they want to or not. But we're going to actually, I think this is a good transition back to our sources, if that's okay, because we're going to see, I think, some sources that relate to this more directly. Can I share? I can share my screen if that's better.
You can. I'm not sure if Tani stepped away for a second, but yeah.
Okay, great. I will do that.
Okay, Tani.
Okay,
Tani,
awesome. Okay. Good. So we're going to turn now to a source from many centuries after the Torah, from the Babylonian Talmud, that is now going to provide its own take on what it means to fulfill this commandment of love. The rabbis are also grappling with this question. What exactly does this mean? So the Talmud tells us one is obligated to recite a blessing for the bad that befalls him, just as he recites a blessing for the good that befalls him. Why? As it is stated, okay, and here's our verse. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love the Lord your God, v'chol levavcha, uv'chol nafshecha, uv'chol meodecha, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So the rabbis are going to give their own explanation of what this means. With all your heart, this means with your two inclinations, with your good inclination and your evil inclination, both of which must be subjugated to the love of God. Okay, and this could be a whole other class in and of itself, but right, the rabbis believed that people had these inclinations, the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara. Essentially, if you imagine, in like a cartoon, the little angel on one shoulder and the little devil on the other shoulder, that was more or less what they believed. There's actually even a scholar who's argued that they really did kind of think of them as kind of demons. The rabbis really believed in demons. People believed in demons in late antiquity. And so that they actually, like, the angel and the devil on the shoulders were like pretty close to a literal representation of what the rabbis thought were going on there, right? But that you had your sort of, right, inclination towards good, inclination towards bad. And here they're saying both of them should be subjugated to the love of God. That's what it means, b'chol levavcha, with all your heart. With all your soul, this means even if God takes your soul. Again, this could be a whole other class, but there's lots of texts connecting this to the idea that loving God with all your soul is actually connected to acts of martyrdom. Okay, and there's stories about rabbis Rabbi Akiva, who is martyred and actually dies saying this verse and sees this as a fulfillment of this commandment. And with all your might means with all your money, as money is referred to in the Bible as might. Okay, alternatively, it may be explained that with all your might means with every measure that God metes out to you, whether it is good or troublesome, thank God. Okay, so back to our sort of opening line of this text, that one is obligated to recite a blessing for the bad, just as one is obligated to recite a blessing for the good. So to me, this text is very striking in that, at least the way I see it, it's a very explicit acknowledgement of the fact that people do have mixed feelings, right? This is I think, direct answer to the question of, what does it mean? Can I still fulfill the commandment of loving God, even if something terrible has happened to me and I'm feeling alienated from God, I'm feeling furious at God, right? This text is saying, yes, that happens, right? We know that happens. That's okay. That doesn't mean that you're kind of out of the realm of being able to fulfill this commandment, but it means that you have to recite a bracha, that you have to bless God anyway. Okay, I mean, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about morning practices in a few minutes, but I think you can even think about kind of the paradigmatic example of this in contemporary Jewish practice as the act of saying Kaddish, right? Obviously, for people who are saying Kaddish because they are in mourning, their primary feeling is not going to be love of God. I don't think any rabbi, ancient or modern, thinks that people are saying Kaddish because they are genuinely moved to exalt God in this moment of their deepest sorrow, right? But what the rabbis are saying is, right, what's important is that even in those moments, right, when you do have these mixed feelings, right, you can either express or potentially, right, be still working on cultivating your love of God anyway through the act of reciting liturgy. And I think what we're going to see as we turn now back to joy, I know we spent a while on love and we're going to turn back to joy in a second, is that rabbinic sources, I think, do a very good job of striking a balance between, right, on the one hand, acknowledging that mixed emotions are a thing, right? That different people are going to have different emotional responses depending on who they are, depending on what's going on in their lives, right? and that that there are particular actions that can still be helpful in terms of either sort of knowing that you're kind of doing the right thing even when it's hard at that particular moment, or potentially in terms of cultivating a particular emotion that may be useful, right, to continue to cultivate even at a moment when that is feeling hard. So if we can turn now to the next page on the source sheet. I brought one other scholarly source that we don't need to read verbatim, but just to give you a sense. So the same kind of issue that we saw in terms of how scholars of the Bible think about love and kind of grappling with, like, is love an emotion or is it a set of actions? Okay. Scholars of rabbinic literature have the same issue when it comes to joy. And there's a scholar, Gary Anderson, who makes a similar, more or less, argument to Moran about joy in rabbinic sources, which is, look, joy is associated with these particular behaviors, and he names eating and drinking, sex, praise, particular festive clothes, and anointing with oil, right? And he says basically, this helps us with our sticky problem of what does it mean to command joy, right? Who knows what that could mean, right? He says, on first reflection, the idea of commanding an emotion appears quite unusual, if not impossible, right? But if this emotion is understood as a set of concrete behaviors, then it is quite possible to command, okay? So very similar to Moran sort of saying, of course, you can't really command an emotion. It must be that they're just commanding a particular set of behaviors. And that's really what this emotion term means, right? I think Anderson would say something similar. That's really what joy means, is like a particular set of festival actions. But I think that it is something more complicated than that, right? I think that actually, just like Lapsley responded to Moran saying, you know, there's something problematic about thinking of emotions this way, thinking that you can't cultivate emotions, right? And as Rabbi Andelman highlighted, that some of you mentioned, this actually isn't even totally the way we think about emotions anymore, right? Whoever it is who said, you know, actually we do talk about smile and you will actually feel happier. And this is something that, you know, is really proven in, you know, psychological literature, right? There are all kinds of examples of, I think, ways in which we as moderns have become increasingly aware that we can't make this total separation between emotion, right, the emotional world, the internal world on the one hand, and the external physical behavioral world on the other hand, right? And sort of in pop psychology, right? I don't know how many of you have heard of the idea of, right, the power pose. This became like a whole thing on TED Talks, this idea that, right, if you want to feel confident before, you know, giving a public lecture or doing something scary, right, that you should strike some kind of confident pose, and that actually changes the way you feel, and you will actually then come to have more confidence, right? And in terms of, you know, the connection between psychology and medicine, I think is another sort of area in which we're realizing how closely connected emotions, right, internal emotions and sort of our physical bodies are, right? Thinking about, right, we know now that stress, that tension, right, feeling anxious can affect, right, our physical health, right? And that to say that something is psychosomatic, right? To say that a physical symptom is caused by an emotional reality is in no way to take away from the reality, right, of that physical symptom, right? Emotions, our emotional states really do impact the way our bodies function, the way our bodies move around in the world. And so, right, if we're gonna think about emotions this way, and I think it's actually closer to the way the rabbis thought about emotions too, this can maybe help us a little bit in our understanding of what these emotional commandments are. And one of the things that the rabbis also, I think, helpfully add, and we're going to look now at source number 9, which is the rabbinic sort of interpretation of this commandment to rejoice, is also the acknowledgement that, right, if we're going to be asking people to feel an emotion, sort of cultivate that emotion through a particular set of actions, that also those actions can't necessarily be completely universal. Okay, so the rabbis quote this verse that we looked at from Devarim about not just you, but all these various other members of your household and people in the community rejoicing. And the rabbis say, okay, how should we do this? With what should we make them rejoice? So the first answer is with wine. Okay, so all right, that's a start. But right, probably some of you are thinking like, yeah, great, like that is a great answer for me. I love wine. And some of you are probably thinking, I don't care about wine. And some of you might be thinking that's terrible because of, you know, a history with alcoholism, you know, for me or family members or friends. And that would be like the worst possible answer for me. And so the rabbis actually acknowledge, yeah, you can't give one answer that is going to fit everybody. Now, the example that they give is unfortunately pretty gender normative, okay? But I think that taking out the sort of gender essentialism and what we're about to see, what they're going to do is say, yeah, different people actually are going to need different sort of ritual objects or actions. So Rabbi Yehuda says, one should enable each member of his household to rejoice with an item that pleases them, men with what is fit for them and women with what is fit for them. He elaborates, men with what is fit for them, okay, meaning wine, and as for the women, with what should one cause them to rejoice? Rav Yosef teaches, one should delight them with new clothes. Okay, and this is going to be different depending on where they live. In Babylonia with colored clothes, and in Eretz Yisrael with the pressed linen clothes that are manufactured there. Okay, and the passage ends with another rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, saying, yeah, and in fact, this is different than what people used to do when the temple was standing, right? When the temple was standing, they would feel joy through the eating of sacrificial meat, right? Now, no temple, so it's going to have to be wine or maybe clothes, right? And I think this is really powerful, actually, as an acknowledgement that, right, yes, we do use actions and we use these sort of communal ritual actions in order to cultivate specific emotions. But those actions, the rabbis are reminding us, are going to have to be different depending on people's time and place, right? Different historical circumstances, and depending on who people are, right? What is their identity? What have they maybe been taught is going to make them feel joy, right? What sorts of things maybe are actually going to be more of a struggle or a downer for them rather than a source of joy, right? And having some degree of flexibility there in terms of what ritual, festive rejoicing is going to look like, right? And I think, as I mentioned, right, the rabbis don't talk about this, but some of the figures who are listed in the biblical verse, right, are probably people who right, might find joy to be quite difficult in their daily lives, might actually be feeling quite alienated from the society around them, right? The stranger, the fatherless, the widow in your gates, right? These are people who sort of are conventionally, right? The Torah mentions as kind of people who are alienated and oppressed, right? So what is it going to mean to encourage those people to feel joy? Well, probably something pretty different than what it's going to mean to encourage, some kind of wealthy householder type to feel joy, right? And I think if we kind of continue the rabbi's train of thought here, it's actually really encouraging us to, think somewhat empathically, or maybe just ask people, right? Okay, where is it that you're coming from? And what is it, right, that you're going to need in order to get to this emotional state? And I want to just close by looking at one more source from rabbinic texts about joy. This is source number 10 on the last page of your source sheet, that I think may be something that's perhaps more relatable, something that people have maybe experienced in their own lives or lives of people in their community, than thinking about wine at a holiday or not, which is the question of, right, not just what happens when people have mixed feelings, but what happens when there's actually some kind of conflicting ritual obligation when it comes to questions of emotion. And in particular, what happens when there is a conflict between the obligation to rejoice on a festival and the obligation to mourn for somebody who has died. So the rabbis tell us that, right, these things can't both happen at once in a ritual way. Okay, so if there is a mourning period that had already begun, meaning if somebody had already started to sit Shiva before the outset of a festival, okay, then the rabbis tell us the mitzvah of rejoicing on the festival, which is a community obligation, comes and overrides the mitzvah of the individual to sit Shiva, right? So some of you may be familiar with this, right? The idea that if somebody is sitting Shiva, observing the 7 days of mourning for somebody who has died, and then let's say on the fourth day, it's a holiday, it's the start of Passover, so actually the Shiva is going to end early, according to rabbinic tradition. But if the mourning period begins during the festival, if it starts on Yom Tov, during the holiday, then the mitzvah of the individual does not come and override the mitzvah of the community, right? So we don't interrupt the community obligation to rejoice during the holiday for the individual's obligation to mourn or to sit Shiva. And I'll just say, again, I think this is an example of a rabbinic law about emotion that at first glance is quite challenging, right? And as are, I think, a lot of the mourning laws, right? The flip side of, for example, right, the idea that an individual who's in mourning is not going to attend a public celebration like a wedding, right? There's a sense in which these kinds of laws that say, okay, at this moment, you're going to be doing the rejoicing thing. At this moment, you're going to be doing the mourning thing, right? Can come across as restrictive, right? Or as sort of overly, right, telling people, right, you have to feel this way at this time, right? Stirring up those, again, other feelings of how can you tell me that I have to feel this way now? I'm feeling this other way. But I think we can also think about these laws as acknowledging that people do have these mixed feelings and that people do have multiple axes that are pulling them to feel particular ways, right? That you're going to have one axis along which you are mourning, right, your particular loss. You're going to have maybe another potential axis in which you're going to feel obligated to the community in a particular way, obligated to, you know, your friend who has invited you to their wedding, right? And that what rabbinic sources, I think, are trying to do as best they can is to acknowledge that everybody all the time is going to be facing those conflicts and those tensions, and to at least offer a framework for, okay, you don't have to make that choice yourself. You don't have to sit in that discomfort of, right, kind of feeling like you are emotionally in two places at once, right? But actually helping people set by saying, right, here's what your priorities are going to be right now at this moment, when actually, of course, you're going to be feeling incredibly torn. And I'll just say, I'll give an example in the name of the person who I heard it from, who's actually one of our rabbinical students, Amelia Wolf, right? That the restriction, you know, that's sort of framed often as a restriction of telling mourners that they should not attend weddings, you know, potentially for the year following their mourning, the year of their mourning period, right? We can think of it as a restriction, but we can also think of it as protecting the mourner in some way. That, right, for somebody who's feeling like, oh my God, I don't have it in me to go to this wedding. I'm going to have to show up and pretend that I'm happy, and I'm not happy. I'm sad, and I'm sad that I can't share this experience with, you know, my loved one who I'm missing, you know, or whatever it is, right? That actually the rabbinic halachot, the rabbinic laws around mourning are there to say, you don't have to make that choice. Right? That choice is actually being made for you. We know, we understand that people are going to have these mixed feelings. And right, to the best that they can, right, the rabbis are trying to guide us through that and help sort of encourage us towards what our priorities should be. Okay. I think we should stop there. I'm going to turn it back over to Rabbi Anselman for, I know we're sort of running out of time, but if there's like maybe one last question or comment, and then I know Rabbi Anselman wanted to say a few words to wrap up.
Yeah, there's so much I want to ask. Well, I'll just raise a couple of things that have come up really quickly. I don't know if we have time to address them or not, but someone raised the issue of kind of potential tension, you know, in light of the source you just shared, coming up on Pesach, right? Some of us might be celebrating, like really feeling sense of freedom, being in a different stage of the pandemic. Hopefully that will stay that way, while you know, while we're still aware of intense suffering in the world. I know people are very mindful of what's going on in Ukraine. So there really is, it's kind of another example of not necessarily the community that you're in, but the more global community, the global Jewish community, both. That's often a tension. Where am I versus where other people are? And it's not just the individual mourning and the community feeling joy, but you can have the reverse also, and sort of feeling some, you know, some guilt about that. And then another tension that came up, oh gosh, we're out of time. All right, well, hopefully people can stay for 2 more minutes. Do you want to respond to that? Yeah, did you want to respond to that, or just let that be?
I'll let that be. I think
Okay.
I think it's an excellent contemporary example of you know, the kind of things that we've been talking about.
Okay. I guess just another thing I've been thinking about, and I like, I guess where we ended up, you know, at the end of our last session of the series is really about tension between emotions and the different parts of ourselves. I was thinking about in Michal Springer's session in particular, we talked about, which was about loneliness, we talked about the importance of kind of acknowledging and articulating where you are, right, and which has been especially the case for a lot of people during the pandemic, as a crucial aspect of this, not sort of pretending, denying the emotion that you're feeling, denying being in a low place, pretending that you're not, or thinking that it's a personal failing to be in a low place. So kind of that importance on the one hand versus what you've been raising today, right, that if we're kind of only acknowledging I'm in this low place and we're not working to cultivate feelings that might bring us to another place, right? So they're a little bit in tension there, and maybe that's a fitting end to the series, that right, that we're complex beings, and there are good things that come out of negative emotions, and vice versa, and we're sort of on a daily and lifelong basis kind of struggling to find the sweet spots that will lead to a healthy, psychologically healthy life, and one where we can marshal our inner resources to bring meaning and happiness to others.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I'll just say, I'm very happy to hear from people via email. I know there's not time to get to everybody's questions, and that we're already 2 minutes over, but I really totally happy for folks to email me. I think my email is on the source sheet. So please reach out if you'd like.
So thank you so much, Dr. Wolf, for teaching today, and again for inspiring the series and for closing us out in this way. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to our sponsors again for today. And I hope very much that we will be learning again with you after Pesach. And in the meantime, hope everyone, I guess, navigates that tension that we've just been talking about in a way that that brings meaning to the various emotions that you want to kind of bring into the world and meditate upon, and make manifest. And so Chag Sameach in advance, and we will see you on the flip side. Thanks, everyone.